Historians of Reddit, what's a devastating event that no one talks about? In 1859, solar flares hit the Earth, causing an aurora borealis effect to be seen all over the world. It lasted for several days, during which time it was reportedly bright enough to read by at midnight. Telegraph operators reported receiving shocks and burns from the devices, and in some cases removed the batteries powering the telegraphs, as signals were being disrupted by the geomagnetic storm. After removing the batteries, the telegraphs still operated, in some cases better than they had when powered. It wasn't particularly devastating at the time, but it's estimated that if a similar storm were to hit us today, it would cripple the entire planet for potentially decades. The estimated repair cost in the US alone is measured in the trillions. In 2012, a similar storm missed the Earth by 9 days. Web link. To add to this a little, extreme space weather can cause quite a variety of problems. Most notable is the problems with power grids, where the long, conducting power lines that form the grid experience geomagnetically induced currents, GICs. As the Earth's magnetic field varies on a large scale, current is induced because you have a conductor and magnetic field I motion relative to one another. GICs are bad because they can cause problems in transformers, saturation, which in turn can lead to damage or disabling of the transformers. These transformers are extremely expensive and take time to manufacture, which means keeping spares around is difficult, as is procuring new ones. Another problem is the effect on radio communications. Space weather can cause temporary degradation in radio propagation, and if it's really bad, it could be on the scale of a radio blackout on the sun-facing side of the Earth for a few days. As well as that, there's the potential damage that solar energetic particles can do to electronics, particularly on spacecraft. These particles can flip bits in memory, causing errors or phantom commands, and can also cause a buildup of charge on a spacecraft's skin, surface charging. It is possible for the charge to build up enough for it to arc from the spacecraft's skin to the sensitive electronics, which of course is bad and can damage them. And finally, there's an increased radiation risk during a solar storm to astronauts and passengers on high-altitude flights, particularly on routes near the poles. However, it's not all bad. Awareness of these issues is on the rise, particularly among countries who have been affected in the past. In 1989, Quebec's grid experienced collapse associated with GICs, leaving 6 million people without power for 9 hours and some for days, and nowadays grid operators are acutely aware of the potential problems space weather can bring. New methods of monitoring for GICs are being implemented and GIC-resistant transformers are being developed, although these will of course take time to be fully developed and then phased in. Obligatory. Not a historian, but I'm in college studying history. The year of living dangerously in Indonesia in 1965-66 saw absolute chaos and still has a marked effect on their society. It is possibly one of the largest mass killings of the last century, and I had heard nothing about it ever, living in the West. It's hard to say how many people actually died, but estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000, and even on up to 500,000 or a million dead. Basically, the Communist Party in Indonesia was heavily influenced by Maoism and ethnic Chinese civilians. It was the largest communist party outside of China. President Sukarno, who had helped the country through Japanese occupation and independence from the Dutch/British, had kept the house of cards balanced, but was beginning to be swayed by communist policies. The military, staunchly anti-communist, and largely supported by the US, would be looking to take power. One night, 6 high-ranking members of the military were abducted and killed. The army spread the word that the communists were to blame and initiated mass reprisals. Killings, torture and imprisonment ran rampant over the islands, and even ethnic Chinese or just suspected communists were taken. Despite working with Sukarno for many years, the US would support his liquidation and the rise of the military. It is unclear how extensive American support to the army was, but it is probable they aided in training and may have even helped compile names of communists to the army. Eventually, a general by the name of Suharto would take power and Sukarno would be placed under house arrest with no power. Today, the massacres and chaos are not really taught in Indonesian schools, and it's clear that many have not come to terms with what happened. However, the mass killings of possibly 1 million or more people should rank up there in devastating events. The Andi Massacre of 2005 in Uzbekistan. It is largest mass shooting in Asia since Tiananmen Square, with over 1,000 killed and even more wounded. The Uzbek government forcefully silenced reform protests by firing into the crowd and then kicked out 90% of Westerners in the country when the US government and UN tried to investigate. Terrible loss of life that rarely gets remembered because the Uzbek government tried so hard to cover it up. Edit. I know this because my family was one of the many permanently kicked out when I was 2 years old. Man, I'm from Kazakhstan and heard about every other thing mentioned in comments but not crap that happened right in the neighboring country. Something that is well known but not that much is the Goyanya accident in Brazil, where cesium-137 was handled by many people, including children. It is regarded as the worst radioactive incident to happen in Brazil. It was a radioactive contamination accident that happened on September 13, 1987 after a radiotherapy machine from an abandoned hospital was illegally stripped for parts and said parts were stolen. On September 16 one of the thieves opened a cesium capsule and then on September 18 sold it to a scrapyard. At that same night the owner of the scrapyard saw a blue glow in the machine's parts, which was the cesium capsule that had been opened. Thinking it might be valuable he brought it to his home. Over the next 3 days he invited friends and family to see the strange glowing substance. On September 21 one of his friends succeeded in freeing several rice-sized grains of the glowing material from the opened capsule. He then started sharing some of them with friends and family. On September 25 the capsule was again sold to another scrapyard. Although 1 day before the sale more dust was removed from the capsule by the scrapyard owner's brother. The brother then took the dust home and spread it on the concrete floor where later his daughter would play in, and with the dust she also ate while sitting on the floor, and then dust particles fell under her food, contaminating it. In the morning of September 29 it was confirmed that the material was radioactive and the doctors persuaded authorities to take immediate action on the matter. The city, state, and national governments were all aware of the incident by the end of the day. News of the radiation incident was broadcast on local, national, and international media. Within days, nearly 130,000 people went to local hospitals concerned that they might have been exposed. Of those, only 250 were indeed contaminated, some with radioactive residue still on their skin. 4 of those people died, including a 6-year-old girl, the one that ate food that had been contaminated by dust particles. Edit. Sorry for any grammar errors. Edit 2. For those who are making fun of the child's death or calling these people ignorant/stupid. 1. The child wasn't fed the dust, particles contaminated her food. 2. The dust looked like glitter, that's the reason why people thought it was harmless and handed it to friends and family. Highly recommend the 1990 movie Cesio-137, O Pesadelo de Goyanya, Cesium-137, The Nightmare of Goyanya, by Roberto Piri so you can get a better understanding of what happened. 3. Those people were in their majority poor and probably didn't have access to almost, if any, education. In the 70s 80s having completed high school was uncommon for people from poor origins, and even if they did, the public education from Brazil wasn't that great, and probably didn't even know radiation poisoning was a thing. 4. Have some little respect for the child. She died alone in the hospital because staff were so afraid of going into her room and getting contaminated. She also had to be buried in a closed lead casket, and there were protesters asking for her not to be buried in a public graveyard. Imagine being the parent of the child and realizing you did this because you didn't even know that radiation was a thing that existed. Have some compassion and respect for these families. This is the report on it. It's really detailed. Web link. I'm not really a proper historian, but I feel the need to mention the Bronze Age collapse. It's not as though nobody talks about it at all, but considering how catastrophic it was, it doesn't get nearly enough attention. At this time, civilizations were still pretty scarce, but the Eastern Mediterranean was full of them. We can't pinpoint an exact reason, but at some point, it all fell apart. The Mycenaeans? Gone. The Hittites? Gone. The Minoans? Gone. The Egyptians? Barely clinging on and having serious problems. There are many things that happened around that time in that general area that could be the culprit: volcanoes, earthquakes, drought, famine, war, and invasions from foreigners that came by boat that historians have named the Sea People because we have basically no idea where they came from. In reality, it was probably a combination of some or even all of them. Again, I'm not a proper historian by any means, but this is what I heard. Actual historians, feel free to correct any mistakes or mention something I missed. The Hittites are especially interesting since we had no hard evidence for them till the 19th century. The only mention of them was the Bible, and people thought there was no way a nation as powerful as described could just up and vanish, so it had to be mythological. The lo and behold big old Bronze Age empire. What exactly did archaeologists find to confirm their existence? They found massive underground cities in central Turkey. The cities were forgotten and rediscovered in the 20th century. Turkey seems to be a hotbed for archaeology, with this and Göbekli Tepe. Makes sense. Turkey has a ton of archaeology and history when considering how many empires have been there, from the Hittites to the Persians to the Macedonians to the Mongols to the Romans to the Ottomans. There have always been a ton of empires in the area. Its geographical location is probably the biggest reason why, I reckon. Access to the Black Sea and Mediterranean, basically being the land bridge from Europe to Asia and vice versa, and by extension Africa. Those are some pretty heavy boons. It's crazy how a geological event forcing a whole culture to flee further and further south from their homeland completely rewrote history. I've been watching a lot of documentaries leading up to and including the fall of the Bronze Age, and its honesty just mind-blowing. This is fairly recent, started in 1998 and ended in 2003, but the Second Congo War. It's the deadliest conflict since World War II, with about 5.4 million deaths, a vast majority of them due to malnutrition and disease. Edit, glad to see this post getting so much attention. As some of you mentioned, a lot of African history is overlooked, so here are a few more 20th century African conflicts to look into if you are interested. Boer Wars, Mau Mau Uprising, Rhodesian Bush War, First and Second Liberian Civil War, Sierra Leone Civil War, Angolan Civil War, First and Second Sudanese Civil War, Somali Civil War, Eritrean Ethiopian War, Congo Crisis, Nigerian Civil War. Rwanda didn't have an air force and very little mechanization, so they invaded by literally hijacking civilian airliners and flying them into the Congo. This, while certainly a surprise, left the invading force stranded behind enemy lines once they lost the airport. Seeing as Congo and its allies were better trained and equipped, it didn't go too well. It's called Operation Katona, and it's an interesting story if nothing else. I didn't know that. Wow, a post-World War II conflict deadlier than Vietnam sounds horrifying. The entire history of the Congo after King Leopold II is sickening. I meant to include the Leopold II part because he halved the population in 40 years. I'm always amazed that people know so little about Pol Pot in Cambodia. His regime killed 25% of its population. Let that sink in, 1 in 4. If you were educated, you were first killed. The extent of what happened in Cambodia really is hard to fathom. I spent 2 months traveling around SE Asia a few years back, and one of the days that will always be fresh in my memory was the somber trip to the killing fields outside of Siem Reap. Our driver, Mr. Sony, was touring us around to various historical sites, S21 Museum as well, and would never step foot into any of them. I remember asking him if he had ever been into any of these sites, and he said, "I don't go in because my entire family is in there." Absolutely heartbreaking. A huge portion of an entire generation was wiped out. Edit, Phnom Penh, not Siem Reap. Mixed them up. I've been to the killing fields and it is absolutely blood-curdling. Never have I felt such a distinct negative energy from walking into the rooms. Went on a high school expedition and most of my classmates were crying at the end of the tour. As a Cambodian, thank you for mentioning this. Because of Pol Pot, my country suffered years of brutality. They will feed people porridges but very little grain of rice, mostly only the broth, and educated people were all killed. Forced to work extremely hard in the countryside, and this made my country development tremendously slowed down. I recommend a read of the book First They Killed My Father. It's an autobiography telling of the events that transpired in those times. Also, Pol Pot left enough landmines to kill the current population twice over. There's a movie adaptation on Netflix right now of it. Is it the one directed by Angelina Jolie? I'm Filipino and we never even touched on this subject in school when we're so close to Cambodia. I never knew this happened until I watched the movie. Absolutely heart-wrenching. Baghdad used to be one of the biggest and most vibrant cities in the world in the 1200s. Until the Mongols came. Baghdad did not recover its year 1200 population until the 1980s. It was, in fact, the most populous city in the world for quite some time during the Middle Ages. It was also the epicenter of intellectual, cultural, and artistic exchange for scholars and other brilliant thinkers the world over. And then, of course, the Mongols came. Holy F what? Seriously, Mongols absolutely destroyed the Middle Eastern societies at the time. It wasn't even a fight, they just went from city to city with the siege knowledge they had acquired from invading China and destroyed them. Genghis Khan was interesting, crazy to think that the Mongol Empire was also the biggest empire to ever exist. Edit. Contiguous Land Empire. To anyone interested, I recommend the Wrath of the Khans podcast by Dan Carlin. It's a 5-part podcast that's more than 12 hours long and will give you a lot of info on this annoying but important specification. At its height, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous empire, where it was all connected by land in total area. The British Empire at its height had approximately 24% of all land on Earth. Even crazier, at its height the East India Trading Company had a larger army than the British Empire in terms of manpower. Well yes, but that's because apart from the Napoleonic Wars, the British Army was essentially tiny until 1914. The British Empire relied on having a great navy instead. Basically several natural disasters and social upheaval abso-effing-lutely devastated multiple societies. It's thought that a volcanic eruption blocked out enough sun to cause crop failures across Europe and as far as China. While this was happening, terrible plagues were also afflicting the Middle East. Economies everywhere fell to ruin and stagnation in the years that followed because several other eruptions later made things worse. Web link. Just makes me wonder when a big volcano like Krakatoa is going to pop off again. During World War II, the Japanese had invaded the Alaskan island of Attu. On the island was the village of Attu where the Aleutian tribe had lived for centuries. The only non-natives were the wife schoolteacher and priest husband who were elderly and beloved by the townspeople. The husband was shot in front of his wife by the Japanese. After that, the Japanese loaded the native population onto ships back to Japan where they worked in POW camps where many died from disease and execution. The Japanese saw them as lower than soldier POW and almost subhuman because they didn't fight back and thus treated them horribly. When the war ended, only a handful of the native population survived and they went back home only to find their village burned down. They left the island and it now remains uninhabited basically, driving the Attu tribe to extinction. Years later the Japanese left a peace monument on the island in honor of the American and Japanese soldiers that died there but have yet to apologize to the descendants of the Attu tribe they destroyed. Edit. Grammar and corrections. Due to its lack of population and unique location, Attu has become a bastion for bird-watching enthusiasts aka birders. As featured in the Steve Martin comedy The Big Year, which itself is a relatively unknown and underrated comedy. Taiping Heavenly Kingdom of Hongshuchuan. Put simply, it was a usurped kingdom in 1850s China that directly and indirectly led to the deaths of millions, maybe 10 million plus, of people through massacre and famine. Hongshuchuan believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and persuaded enough people to follow along and start a civil war. Check out God's Chinese Son, by Jonathan Spence. 10 million combatants could be as many as double that when counting civilian deaths. In only 14 years. The entire period of Qing collapse would fit this thread, to be honest. So much of it is batcrap insane and tragic. The Taiping Rebellion is one of the most extraordinary events in human history that is virtually unheard of in the West. Perhaps as many as 70 million people died in the conflict. The Taipings were truly revolutionary, as they demanded absolute equality between women and men. When they conquered a city, they would give the inhabitants a choice to join them or die. Those that chose not to join were killed, all of them. The conflict lasted for 21 years, 1850 to 1871, and may be the second deadliest war in human history. They would give the inhabitants a choice to join them or die. What was life like for the people who chose to join them? Unless life with them would be exceptionally bad, it seems the obvious choice would be just to join them, rather than be killed. They demanded total militarization, probably to an even greater degree than the fascist regimes of World War II did. Every second child in your family was forcibly conscripted. If you weren't literally on active duty, you were either building a forge or finding ways to get Western armaments into the country. I talked about this on a similar prompt a month or so ago, but I think people should know about this event, so I'm copying and pasting it again here. The New London School Explosion. On the afternoon of March 18, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, Texas turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this couldn't ever happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family, so I didn't really know too much about it, other than the fact that he'd survived, until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated, so my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his, actually very interesting, life, including a big section on the New London School explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. He was in 8th grade when it happened, in his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom, as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row, and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time, and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies, and parts of bodies, everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive, but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boys started lowering the badly injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath, most of it absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in, so that there was some sense of normalcy when schools started again in the fall. Papa had played French horn in the school band. However, when schools started up again, was asked to switch to trumpet, as the entire trumpet section had been killed. My grandfather went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflict in the Pacific, including Peleliu and the liberation of Manila. But he said that nothing he saw was ever as bad as what he saw the day of the explosion. I'm always amazed that more people don't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Edit. Wow, Thanks for all of the comments and awards. This was a very nice thing to find when I woke up bleary-eyed to feed my baby this morning. I'm linking to my original post at the bottom here. I'd added a few extra tidbits there that might be of interest, including a bit of a happy ending story for Papa, in case you need some cheering up after reading this. Web link. Thanks for sharing so much personal detail. Hopefully this story is seen in this thread. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. This effed me up. Imagine the guilt the teacher felt knowing she picked whomever would die when switching seats. So your comment got me thinking. I went back to Papa's memoirs and found his teacher's name is Miss McDavid. I found a Grace McDavid who taught English in the 1936 New London Yearbook, posted online on the museum's website, so I think that must be her. I googled her and found her obituary online. It looks like she was about 33 at the time of the explosion. She did recover from her injuries and continued to teach at the school until her retirement in 1966. As far as I can tell, she never married or had any children. She died in Virginia in 1997, actually just a year before Papa died. I wonder what her life was like after the blast. Almost 300 died and 300 people survived. Weird. Also, another fact from Wiki students had been complaining of headaches for some time, but little attention had been paid to the issue, but again the gas was odorless. Also WTF. Adolf Hitler, who was the German chancellor at the time, paid his respects in the form of a telegram, a copy of which is on display at the London Museum. 2122. Something similar happened in my hometown in 2013. A family had smelled gas on their property and called the local fire department. They, as well as their gas company, came out and neither were able to locate any problems, but they assured the homeowner that there wasn't anything to worry about. A couple of hours later, the father was in the driveway preparing to take his daughter to school. She forgot something inside, went back in and turned on her bedroom light. That light threw a spark and blew the house into pieces. 13 years old, and she died due to the incompetence of the gas company. Her father had run into the inferno looking for his little girl and nearly died himself. His son would have most likely lost his life also, had he not skipped school to go deer hunting that morning. Ended up winning a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the gas company for wrongful death. I lived 5 miles away at the time, and not only did I hear the explosion, my garage door came up almost a foot and slammed back down. Such a tragic story. There's so many that I would go with, that will probably be mentioned in other comments, but I think any stories about workers in the early 1900s are pretty horrible. Is a pretty horrible event, for example. After being told that the paint was harmless, the women in each facility ingested deadly amounts of radium after being instructed to point their brushes on their lips in order to give them a fine tip. Some also painted their fingernails, face, and teeth with the glowing substance. The women were instructed to point their brushes in this way because using rags or a water rinse caused them to use more time and material, as the rinse was made from powdered radium, gum arabic, and water. Many women died and became sick with horrendous diseases. One woman named Molly Maggie had her jawbone crumble. By May, her dentist thought Molly needed surgery to remove a fast-growing abscess he'd found on her jaw. When he got the gums open, the bone didn't look right, as it was too ashy and gray, so he gently prodded it with his finger. To his shock and horror, the whole bone crumbled under his fingertip like ashes in a fireplace. Instead of removing a tumor, he wound up digging Molly's entire left jaw out with nothing but his fingers. Unbeknownst to him, the radium had perforated the bone cells and stripped them of calcium. It had, like a little machine gun, shredded the collagen inside the bone and left it as little more than a pile of splinters. There's also a great book on this called The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of American Shining Women by Kate Moore. This whole story is extremely depressing. Work in the 1800s and early 1900s was pretty horrible for a lot of women, men, and children. Brew wenches, female miners in the 19th century, you can look that up, children in chimney sweeps, etc. Web link. I've read the book, it's just horrifying. The worst part, for me, was during one of the trials. A doctor was testifying, reading the medical records of one patient, and came to the end where he said the prognosis was terminal. Suddenly someone started screaming. It was the woman whose medical records were being read. None of the doctors had told her she was dying, so that's how she found out. I just finished that book, too. When he was asked if she was terminal, he was taken aback, and responded, in front of her. It was common at the time to not share that type of news with patients, and still is in some cultures. Damn, good thing doctors will tell you that kind of stuff now. I'd want to know so I can make preparations. This whole story is just so sad. And the saddest part is that these women were literally fighting for compensation on their deathbeds and only a few received justice before they died. Talk about manipulating vulnerable people into doing your dirty work. There's a movie coming about it soon with Joey King. Didn't their employers, who knew the dangers and still encouraged all of this, of course, discredit and publicly shame them, saying they contracted syphilis? Yes, the first girl who died had it officially written on her death certificate that she had died of syphilis because they couldn't figure out why she died, but she had tested positive for syphilis. They tried to use that as a tactic against other girls who were coming forward with similar issues. It's worse than that she tested negative for syphilis more than once. They just changed the test results because she lived alone, and that clearly meant she was sleeping around and it had to be syphilis. It was actually Molly who had syphilis. Molly's death had been attributed to syphilis, which the company gleefully cited after the accusations and lawsuits started rolling in. This is from the same article that tells of her jaw disintegrating. You think it's bad, but it's even worse. The Radium Dial Corporation had a factory in Ottawa, Illinois, just off the Illinois River. The warehouse basement was a dirt floor, and that's where they stored all the paint. Paint that splattered and spilled all over the dirt floor, seeped into the ground, and not only contaminated the site, but probably the Illinois River. The river serves as Ottawa's water supply, and ultimately spills into the Mississippi River. The corporation was still in violation even into the 70s. There's an old documentary I watched in high school chemistry class about it. Ottawa is a neighboring town to my hometown. It's some pretty crazy crap. Oh, it is nuts how many big corporations just carelessly pollute and get away with it. There's a region of Louisiana known as Cancer Alley because of the unusual number of cancer cases that occur there. It's a group of majority black counties that also has a disproportionate amount of oil refineries built there. Then there was Love Canal, a suburb that was built on top of ground that was so polluted it was essentially a sea of poison, and occasionally the toxic waste that was dumped there would bubble into people's basements or even up to the surface because it was just dirt dumped on top of a waste dump. Residents were not informed of the land's previous usage, and a bunch of children was born with physical deformities. They had to take EPA staff hostage to get the federal government to help them leave. One woman named Molly Maggie had her jawbone crumble. You can read about that here. Nah, you're all right, I'll give that one a miss. God, that sounds painful. Poor lady. The Mayan society and the lost scriptures that we still haven't found on top of the scriptures we still can't seem to decipher. Galveston, Texas was once considered to be one of the most important commercial ports in the United States and was referred to by several fantastical names such as the Queen City of the Gulf and the Wall Street of the West. All that changed when it suffered a near-direct hit from a devastating Category 4 hurricane in 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Pretty much the entire city was destroyed by a storm surge and anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people died. Galveston was rebuilt, but it never truly regained its status. Houston became the state's commercial center in the storm's wake, in addition to other factors. There's a great book about this called Isaac Storm by Eric Larson. The Texas City explosion of 1947 is also not widely known despite being the biggest industrial accident in U.S. history and one of the largest non-nuclear explosions of all time, especially relevant considering its similarities to the Beirut disaster. I think it was right under the Halifax explosion. World War I munition boat exploded and took out Halifax and Dartmouth. Munition ship on fire, stop train. Coleman. There's no time. Train's coming in towards Pier 6, I got to warn M. Come on, Vince, come on. There are 700 people aboard it, I've got to stop it. Come on, acknowledge. Halifax was devastated. 9,000 wounded, 2,000 dead. Including Vince Coleman, dispatcher. Man, I loved that infomercial. I always thought how a brave badass Vince Coleman was. I worked with a lady who remembered it. The first explosion caused the young men in town to run out and see if anyone needed help. So it was the next explosion that devastated the town. The same thing happened during the Halifax explosion in World War I. There were boats on fire in the harbor, so everyone was catching a peek. One of the ships was full of blasting caps for the front. It was the largest explosion pre-nuclear. Leveled both towns and killed tons of people who were watching the burning ships. I remember watching a documentary on this in school. There was one guy who could tell there was a storm coming. He tried to warn people, but not a lot of people believed him, and there wasn't enough time to evacuate the whole city by then. The town of Indianola, Texas was also a major port town, destined to become a major city when it was wiped off the map by a hurricane. It's now little more than a ghost town. In 1875, the city had a population of 5,000, but on September 15 of that year, a powerful hurricane struck, killing between 150 and 300 and almost entirely destroying the town. Indianola was rebuilt, only to be wiped out on August 19, 1886, by another intense hurricane, which was followed by a fire. Damn, that city was not meant to be. That one king from Monty Python was trying to build a castle there. Oddly, I thought of this one. If you ever get to go to Galveston, do the historical homes tours. They had to fill basements with concrete and bury fences to raise the land. The Bronze Age collapse. Arguably, more devastating than the fall of the West Roman Empire. So much knowledge lost. Truly one of history's great mysteries. I recommend reading up on it. It's really interesting. Until I learned about it, I had no idea that there was once a whole other Dark Ages that happened before what we normally think of as the Dark Ages, although that term is a misnomer. The Bronze Age collapse ushered in a centuries-long Dark Age that lasted until Classical Greece. There's a pretty good YouTube. Still somewhat of a mystery, but seems like a combination drought/famine, civil unrest, breakdown in international trade, punctuated by invasion that came when these countries were at their weakest. Each of these factors fed into the others and made everything much, much worse, resulting in the collapse of civilizations. Web link. Apparently, climate change played a part in things too, with the sea peoples migrating southward to a more bearable climate, being met with hostility, and utterly bitch-slapping several civilizations that stood in their way. Only ones that stood against them were the Egyptians, and even then, it was a Pyrrhic victory. Not to mention a bunch of Mycenaeans getting pissed at their local rulers and staging rebellions and popular uprisings, further destabilizing their entire kingdom. Yep, these are some of the more common theories. But the fact is that we know very little from this time since there was a significant drop in literacy. Another guess behind the collapse is a pandemic that was spread along the major trade routes of the era, encompassing the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, collapsing economic powers and causing uprisings. These theories are not mutually exclusive. Most likely, a lot of them are factors of why it happened. The Rwandan genocide has got to be one of these events. I watched Shake Hands with the Devil here a while ago and highly recommend it. Unspeakable acts of brutality inflicted. Still gives me chills. I hate to break it to you, but it's not over. Just a couple of weeks ago I read this article in the Washington Post, written about Paul Rusesabagina and his daughter. The TLDR is that Paul Rusesabagina, the real-life manager of the Hotel Rwanda at the time, the guy played by Don Cheadle in the movie, was lured last year from his home in San Antonio under false pretext to give a speech in Dubai, but was snatched on the way and is now being held in Rwanda by the administration of a nascent dictator whom Rusesabagina has openly opposed. The article also describes other attempts by the Kagame regime to threaten and or harm him, causing him to flee Europe for the US, but now he is actually in prison in Rwanda. No one has been able to speak with him or contact him directly since he was snatched, and he was only seen in public for the first time months later when he was put on trial by Kagame for inciting violence via his public speaking. His daughter is working desperately to try to get him released, and among other things is trying to get the new Biden administration to help. I wish I were joking. I am not. It's not over for this heroic man at all. Web link. Oh my god. That's awful and just absolutely wild that it's not 2 News. I wonder if Cheadle knows. If I were him, I'd feel compelled to take on the cause. That was a book written by a Canadian? American? General, wasn't it? And the movie Hotel Rwanda brought me to tears as a teenager with how disturbing it was. Yep, book of the same name. Romeo Dallaire was the author. He was a Canadian general in charge of the UN task force. In 535, humans went through hell. Many reported a strange color in the skies, not just in Europe. A dense, dry fog was also reported in Asia and the Middle East. Even the regions, now known as the Americas, weren't spared. For example, drought in Peru. Temperatures were rather low in some places. It snowed either in the summertime. One survivor, a Roman politician named Cassiodorus, explained about the bluish sun and no shadows being cast, even in the noon. It has been hypothesized that Iceland holds the reason for the events between the years 535 and 536. Iceland is known for its volcanoes, and it was possible one such was to blame. Edit. Thanks for the sliver. Something similar happened in 1816, the year without a summer, that was caused by volcanoes in Indonesia erupting in 1815. I believe that would be, and to think less than 100 years later, there was, web link. And that's why we have Frankenstein. Go to Croatia, they said. It'll be sunny, they said. I wish I could just make a monster to squash them all. Interestingly enough, that summer spent indoors is what started Mary Shelley on her path to writing Frankenstein. And then less than a decade later, the Justinian plague hit in 541. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, it was less than a decade after an infamous mass famine. Seems like volcanoes because the earth to cool, mass crop failures and mass starvation happens. Lack of nutrition destroys people's immune systems, and so plague then ravages through. Mass starvation causes people to flock to the cities in search of anything resembling work. There, overcrowding and squalid conditions while suffering from malnutrition causes epidemics, civil war, and other insanity. We have seen this recently in Syria, and will see more of it as climate change drives peoples that are more rural out of their homesteads throughout the world. I would think mass starvation would also cause more people to hunt more exotic foods, like disease-carrying rats and bats. That's supposedly the worst year of known history. The Sea Peoples and Bronze Age collapse associated with it. Seriously, over 1,000 years of culture and progress lost in 100 years. Basically, everything collapsed except Egypt, and it was damaged heavily by the loss of trade and having to defend itself from invasion. The Hodinka Tragedy was supposed to be a celebration of the crowning of Nicholas II as emperor. Around 500,000 people gathered in a field where they would receive free food. Rumors spread that there wouldn't be enough food for everyone, leading to a panic and everyone rushing the field. 1,389 people were trampled to death. Nicholas II responded by going to a party that night. He and his wife didn't want to go to the ball, but his advisors and his powerful uncles insisted, so they went anyway. Apparently, both spent the ball with red-rimmed eyes. Not that this excuses their behavior, but their initial reactions were to mourn the loss of their people. The dude who came up with the first chemical weapons used in World War I went home after the first successful deployment and had a party. His wife told him he was morally bankrupt, went outside, and killed herself that night. He left for the front again the next day to oversee the next deployment of the gas. The dude who came up with the first chemical weapons used in World War I. If you're curious, this is web link. Pakistan's genocide of Bengalis, now Bangladesh, in 1971. Estimation of people killed 200,000 to 3 million Bengalis, and about 200,000 to 400,000 Bengali women were raped. Pakistan still denies the genocide, and hardly anyone talks about it. Web link. Vietnamese boat people. Absolutely crazy, and literally can't believe this happened. And nobody effing ever talks about it. Think about this, it's the Vietnam War, and you are Vietnamese and obviously want nothing to do with it. Many saw their only way out was by sea, due to tensions with neighboring countries. So hordes of people tried to escape the country in little boats. Now here's the kicker, it's estimated that up to 400,000 of them drowned. Most of the women got raped by pirates as well. Everything got stolen. People got sick and starved. Pirates kidnapped people. Absolutely horrible. That wiki page makes me feel bad for ever having complained about anything. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969, even after Hawaii officially became a state. Edit. Holy crap, I did not expect my comment to blow up. Thanks for all the awards and support, guys. Feel free to follow or message me for either geeky epidemiology factoids or not suitable for work content. I love chatting and meeting new people. Nerd face, angelic face. Weren't a lot of them also more or less tossed from their boats and made to climb cliffs to even get to the island? I listened to a podcast about this and can't remember exactly. Also, descendants on the island had to fight to keep their homes once leprosy wasn't a threat and people wanted the land to make money. So true. The podcast I listened to about this is called This Podcast Will Kill You. http://thispodcastwillkillyou.com, web link. Yes. And Ask a Mortician did a great video on it too, web link. There's a really good book about this called Molokai by Alan Brennert. A similar thing happened on an island called Pennakees near New England. Father Damien represented Hawaii in the U.S. Capitol for years for his work helping lepers. Web link. This will probably get buried, but it's somewhat related. China had a similar practice, where they would send people with leprosy to leprosy villages. Even today, many of these leprosy villages live in extreme poverty, and people are afraid to interact with the children of these colonies, even though they are typically 2 generations removed from the infected. I got the chance to volunteer as an English teacher for 2 weeks for a program specifically devoted to helping these children get scholarships. I met a little girl who literally had to climb a mountain to get to school, and then had to take care of her little sister since her parents abandoned them to get jobs in the city. In spite of all that, she was also able to take care of a stray cat as well. Sorry that went off on a tangent, but it's definitely something I didn't know about until I went to China. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to be the first to know about Red Rabbit Reader's new videos. If you like our videos, please like them on YouTube and share them with your friends. We welcome your comments below. Press to start another of our videos.